The United Nations was long considered the greatest peace project in human history. For the first time, all nations truly sat at a common table, and it seemed that problems and disputes were transitioning to being resolved diplomatically rather than militarily. Yet, what sounded like the solution to all conflicts turned out to evolve in a very different direction. While the UN may initially have contributed to resolving conflicts, today, many view it as little more than a bloated, bureaucratic monster that exacerbates conflicts rather than finding pragmatic solutions. Neither in the war in Ukraine, nor in the Middle East, nor in the numerous other global conflict zones has the UN managed to find solutions. Instead, as a democratic organization, it often provides a platform for outright autocrats and dictators. Thus, politicians from various factions and countries now refer to the organization as dead. The Czech Republic recently went as far as to openly discuss leaving the United Nations. But why, in the eyes of so many, has the UN failed? And why does it no longer succeed in resolving conflicts? What would happen if the Czech Republic truly left, and others followed? Would the United Nations then gradually fall apart, signaling the end of multinational diplomacy? All these fascinating questions are examined in today's video. Enjoy! The roots of the UN's current failures trace back to its founding, where numerous mistakes were made. The organization consists of two key bodies, the General Assembly and the Security Council. The former is perhaps what comes to mind first when thinking about the United Nations. In the General Assembly, each of the 193 member states is represented and has one vote. This makes the body uniquely representative, reflecting the principles of sovereignty and equality among states. It convenes annually in September, with individual states able to call for special or emergency sessions to address global challenges. So far, so good. But the actual problem lies in its lack of political power in practice. The General Assembly's resolutions have no legally binding force. It merely has the authority to make recommendations to member states, the Security Council, and other UN bodies. As such, its resolutions are more advisory in nature, making enforcement and adherence to decisions challenging. While these votes may carry significant moral weight, morality alone rarely resolves wars. Thus, the true power lies with the UN Security Council. Unlike the General Assembly's resolutions, the Security Council's decisions are legally binding for all member states. This gives the Security Council the authority to enforce measures critical to war outcomes, ranging from sanctions against states to authorizing military interventions. However, the Security Council also has a structural flaw. It comprises only 15 members, meaning very few states decide on globally significant issues. Moreover, 5 permanent members hold ultimate decision-making power. These 5 states are the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China. Each of these 5 has veto power, allowing them to unilaterally block any decision. This is where the UN's greatest problem lies. We see here a clear division between two blocks. On one side, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. On the other, Russia and China. These blocks routinely block resolutions proposed by the other. Agreement is reached only on a few, usually geopolitically insignificant issues. This includes the appointment of special envoys, or, more recently, the condemnation of Houthi attacks in the Red Sea. These actions amount to mere words, not deeds, or real intervention. In the world's most critical conflict zones, however, there is no consensus. Russia predictably vetoes all resolutions, portraying it as an aggressor, or calling for measures against its war. In the Middle East, the interests of the 5 permanent members are widely divergent, and in a potential conflict over Taiwan, the Security Council would likely be paralyzed. Additionally, the Security Council is often dismissed as a relic of the immediate post-World War period and the Cold War, when France and the United Kingdom still had vast colonial empires, and the Soviet Union and the United States were on equal footing. Today's geopolitical reality has changed dramatically. The influence of France, the United Kingdom, and Russia has significantly declined. Meanwhile, the world has become far more multipolar, with powerful regional players like India, Brazil, and the European Union. The Global South is also gaining influence, but remains poorly represented. For years, there have been calls to reform the UN from the ground up. Many advocate particularly for an expansion of the Security Council. These proposals aim to make its composition more geographically and politically representative by adding new permanent and non-permanent members. Just last year, the German government called for a permanent seat for Germany. Other countries, such as Japan, India, and Brazil, are also pushing for greater representation. However, granting more members veto power would likely worsen the situation further. Thus, many call for reforming the veto system itself. Proposals range from limiting its use to abolishing it entirely. Yet it seems highly unlikely that the permanent members would agree to such changes. The best suggestion might be to limit veto rights, for example, in cases of mass atrocities. But even here, interpretations would likely vary by country. Alternatively, the General Assembly's role could be strengthened, giving its resolutions greater weight or transferring certain decision-making powers from the Security Council. However, these reform proposals have been on the table for decades and remain largely unaddressed. This brings us to the Czech Republic, which has now gone so far as to threaten leaving the organization altogether. This call to exit originated from the Czech foreign minister, outraged after a General Assembly vote. According to the minister, her country had no place in an organization of terrorist sympathizers. This statement came after the General Assembly called for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, but failed to explicitly condemn Hamas's terrorism. Although the Czech Prime Minister quickly backtracked, emphasizing the UN's importance for global peace, he also demanded urgent reforms of the organization. Yet again, the UN failed to find a genuine solution for peace, as the member states' positions were too disparate. Nevertheless, many voices in the Czech Republic still advocate leaving the broken organization. What would happen if the country took this unprecedented step? Initially, it would represent an extraordinary development in international diplomacy and the post-war order. Although the Czech Republic's geopolitical influence is limited, its departure would set a precedent for other dissatisfied states. This could trigger a slow process of disintegration. We actually have a fairly accurate historical parallel: the League of Nations, considered the forerunner of the United Nations. It was established after World War I to prevent another major war. However, the League of Nations suffered from structural flaws, including a unanimity rule that allowed any single member to block decisions. The League also had limited means to enforce its resolutions. As disillusionment grew, the first members left. By the 1930s, authoritarian regimes in Germany, Italy, and Japan blocked its resolutions, ultimately causing its collapse. There are striking parallels to today. It is difficult to make democratic decisions in a world where democracy is in decline and where more authoritarian regimes and dictatorships are reasserting themselves on the global stage. 10 years ago, over half of the world's population lived in democracies. Today, it is only slightly more than 1/4. 42 countries have become more autocratic over the past decade, a record number. Crucially, these are often the most powerful nations. For democratic countries, this presents a dilemma. Dictators, who have entirely abolished democracy in their own countries, participate in democratic votes at the UN, deciding on issues affecting other nations. Meanwhile, they often disregard the very resolutions they vote on, as they are not democracies themselves. Why, then, should democratic countries adhere to resolutions that Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea pushed through? This underscores the urgent need for reform within the United Nations. Having a shared international platform for diplomatic exchange is undeniably vital. Yet, in its current form, the United Nations appears increasingly incapable of action.